Ladies and gentlemen, we are now about to call on stage a Bangalore based historian. His early books included the award winning India After Gandhi and the first volume of this biography, Gandhi Before India, which was the 2014 New York Times notable book and San Francisco Chronicle Best Book of the Year. He writes regularly on social and political issues for the New York Times and for the British and Indian press, including the Telegraph and the Hindustan Times. Ladies and gentlemen, time now to welcome Mr. Ramchandra Guha for his keynote address.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here at my favorite literary festival, a citizens-funded and sponsored and motivated literary festival. And I'd like you to first give a round of applause to all the extraordinary people who make it possible, who all belong to this city. I'm here to speak about my long and complicated and unfinished life as a Gandhi biographer. But before I come to my experiments with Gandhi, let me first say a little bit about how I became a biographer in the first place. I am in many ways an unlikely biographer. I started life as an economist. I have 2 degrees in economics. And if there is one thing that marks economics, is that it has nothing to do with human beings. It's all abstractions in the form of statistics and equations and charts and graphs. Well, I didn't much take to economics, even though I did 2 degrees in economics, and I must confess that economics took even less to me. And while I was doing my MA, and as a rather indifferent and bored student, I came across the works of a remarkable British anthropologist called Verrier Elwin, who was born in England in 1902, took 2 first-class degrees from Oxford, came to India in 1927 as a missionary, fought with his bishop, left the church, joined Gandhi in Sabarmati, fought with Gandhi and left Gandhi, and spent the rest of his life as a roving anthropologist, living first with the tribals of what is now Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Orissa, about whom he wrote a series of pioneering ethnographies. And after independence, going across to the northeast, where he spent his last decade working in what is now Arunachal Pradesh. He had a very interesting and complicated and colorful life. And while reading his autobiography, I decided to become an anthropologist like him. And I moved to Calcutta to do a PhD in that subject. And my doctoral research was on peasants and forests in the Himalaya. And the original intention was to, as an anthropologist, to spend a year in a village studying the relationship between the villagers and their natural environment. And I took a break from fieldwork and went to the archives in Delhi to trace the longer history of state control over forests and fell in love with archival research, which I must confess is actually easier than doing fieldwork, because unlike human beings, documents don't talk back. So I started as an economist, dealing with numbers and abstractions, to being a social anthropologist who deals with structures and processes, to being a historian who traces the life of societies over the course of time. But all through this journey, I wrote about larger social structural issues, such as the state takeover over the forests, the formation of new laws under British colonialism, the opposition to these laws by workers and peasants, the construction of the post-colonial state, and so on and so forth. But I continued reading about Elwin, because Elwin had written about forests. He had written about how the Adivasis he lived with saw the forests as their home. And this natural landscape of theirs was rudely taken away, was expropriated by the colonial state, who erected a massive quasi-military organization called the Forest Department, which policed the forest boundaries and kept the tribals out. And in one of his ethnographies, Elvin recalls asking a Adivasi, a Gond, in the Mandla district of what is now Madhya Pradesh, what is your idea of heaven? Now, we all have different ideas of heaven. And this Gond replied, my idea of heaven is miles and miles of forests without any forest guards. So, Elvin kept on coming back to my life, even when I was working about these broader sociological and historical processes. So I decided I must write a life on Elvin. But it was an incredibly painful and difficult task. I've written many books, and the book that gave me most grief, that went through the most drafts, that took years and years to craft and bring to fruition, was my biography of Elvin. The research was the easy part. Reading his letters to his mother, reading his letters to Gandhi, reading his anthropological works, reading his polemical writings in the newspapers, interviewing his colleagues in Oxford and Sabarmati and Shillong and Mandla and so on. But the writing was, as I said, very, very painful because nothing in my previous work had prepared me for it. I was moving from structure to process to personality, and given my training in economics and sociology and no literary training at all, I hadn't studied literature. I must confess at that stage, most of our reading was non-fiction, it was not fiction. And reading fiction is actually good preparation for writing biography because you have to delve into character, emotion, relationships. So I wrote a first draft, a second draft, a third draft. My editor, Rukun Advani, then with the Oxford University Press, returned each draft marked up in green, telling me what was wrong with the different sections, the different chapters. And in the year 1994-95, I was offered a fellowship at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Berlin, where I went with my family and two little children, and the fifth draft of my Elvin book. So happened, with which I was deeply dissatisfied. I mean, I'd already written at this stage 2 works of environmental history and 2 books on cricket, which flowed seamlessly from my mind and my pen. You know, they really went through 1.5 drafts. But here was something, a book about a man who had changed my life, who had transformed me professionally, and I was not able to do justice to the controversial, complicated, tortuous journey of his life. In Oxford, in India, with the Adivasis, he went through 2 failed marriages with tribal women. He had very difficult relationships with his children. His work was savaged by his peers, and I was not able to capture any of this. So I went to Berlin with this draft, and I was very fortunate in having, as one of my colleagues, a great biographer, a great British biographer, Nicholas Boyle, who taught German literature at Cambridge and who had written a landmark biography of the German polymath Goethe. And it was through conversations with Nicholas Boyle that I learned the art of biography. I'll come to Gandhi by and by. But first, let me tell you what Nicholas Boyle taught me. And I'm going to summarize the teachings of Nicholas Boyle in terms of 3 laws, which in deference to my teacher's surname, I call the Boyle's laws of biography. Boyle's first law of biography is never anticipate. Sociologists and economists tend to state their thesis in advance. They say, after demonetization, India's GDP fell. And then they go on to explain how it fell. But a life is not lived in the same way. A life is understood backwards but lived forward. For example, in the case of Elvin, as I told you a little while ago, he was a devotee of Gandhi. I hesitate to use the word bhakt because of the connotations it has now acquired. But he was abjectly devoted to Gandhi. He called him a modern Christ when he was living with him in the Sabarmati ashram. then he goes and lives with the Gonds, and he becomes disenchanted with Gandhi because he falls in love. And he writes to Bapu for permission. And Gandhi says, you can marry, but you must take a vow of celibacy before you get married. So that marriage falls apart. He marries the tribal girl, and this time has the good sense not to take Gandhi's permission. Further, living with the Adivasis, Gandhi, of course, enjoined all his followers to take a vow of abstinence, never drinking. But Elwin found that alcohol was central to the Gonds, to their sense of culture, their joy, their music, their dance, and even their sustenance, for their nutrition. And I said already that he quoted a Gond as saying, my idea of heaven is miles and miles of forest without forest guards. And he says later on in the same book, I asked the Gond, what is your idea of hell? Now the first part is true. The second part was embellished by Elwin, I think, this Adivasi idea of hell. According to Elwin, the Adivasi's idea of hell is, if I go to hell, if my maker sends me not up there, but hell, I'll be below the ground, I should be sent to purgatory, under the earth, under a mahua tree, so that I could at least suck the roots while I'm there. Now, when I introduced Elwin and Gandhi, if I am writing about his abject devotion to Gandhi, and they said, no, actually later on he fought with Gandhi, which is what you do if you're spelling out a thesis like an academic. It would spoil the whole story. So the first, or you fall in love and the divorce comes later. Now, Boyle's first law of biography is never anticipate. Never, even if your subject is to radically change his views, even if emotional or intellectual relationships are going to take a very different turn, don't let your reader into the secret, even if you've discovered it in the course of your research. Boyle's second law of biography, which is in some ways probably the most important one from a conceptual literary point of view, is the secondary characters in a biography are as important as the primary character. Too many lives, especially written by Indians, only focus on their hero. And it's all about them or the heroine. But the other people in that life never are vividly portrayed. You know, the friends, the rivals, the family members, the intellectual adversaries, they don't really come to life. And every life is lived amidst a much wider cast, even the most obscure life. And if you're writing about someone like Gandhi, you can't just write about him. You have to bring in all these different people he interacted with, learned from, debated with, was rejected by, and so on and so forth. So this is Boyle's second law. The subject of one's own biography actually emerges most fully only through his or her relationships with friends, rivals, enemies, lovers, spouses, and children. Boyle's third law on biography, which is an extension of the second law, is that the biographer must look energetically for sources that do not emanate from his own subject. Now, Elwin wrote 40 books, 60 pamphlets, 400 newspaper articles, and countless letters. And it's often a biographer's temptation to tell the story through his or her subject's voice, whether published or unpublished. There was a biography of Nehru published many years ago, more than 40 years ago, before many of you were born. And one reviewer in the Hindu did a statistical combination of the footnotes, and he said, he computed that 97% of the footnotes were all attributed to Nehru. There were things he said or wrote, in public or in private. Now, it's very important to look for sources other than those emanating from your subject, particularly if your subject was himself such a prolific writer as Elwin was and as Gandhi turned out to be. So these are Boyle's three laws of biography, which I learnt while writing about Elwin. Never anticipate, always flesh out the secondary characters, and look as diligently as possible for things other people have written about your principal character, not just his words or her words. And to these three laws, I added a fourth law of my own. This is Guha's coda or addendum to Boyle's laws of biography. And this goes as such. Do not be deterred, even if your subject has written a detailed and apparently comprehensive autobiography. Because autobiographies are actually as interesting for what they say as what they conceal. And Guha's addendum to Boyle's laws of biography succinctly stated is this: an autobiography is a preemptive strike against a future biographer. This is my version, and let's see you tell a better version. Because you don't have my literary skills or my intimate personal knowledge. And with Elwin, as with Gandhi, this was a law, because Elwin had written a wonderful autobiography. You know, I wrote on Elwin many years ago, and when I was writing on him in the 90s, and I would meet friends and uncles and aunts and teachers and older relatives, and they would ask what I'm working on. And they would say, I'm writing a life of Elwin. And they would say, but Elwin's written his autobiography. It's such a beautiful book. It changed my whole life, so I know what a beautiful book it is. It also won the Sahitya Award, Sahitya Akademi Award for English. It may be the first work of non-fiction. That award usually goes to novels. It may be the first work of non-fiction to win the Sahitya Akademi Award. But I found there was a hell of a lot he left out. Why his first marriage broke up. The real truth about his second marriage. What he did not say about Gandhi and his complicated feelings. What he did not say about the savaging he received from his intellectual peers about some of the rather fanciful things he wrote. So, and of course with Gandhi, even though Gandhi's autobiography was called My Experiments with Truth, if you go in the epigraph to the first volume of my Gandhi biography, I actually quote from My Experiments with Truth, where Gandhi says, I am sure that one day a hostile critic will come and tell you what's all that has been left out. Now, it's not just that. When I say that you must go beyond, at one level, an autobiography by a famous person is a preemptive strike. You know you're going to get a biographer at one day, quite soon, and you want to get your version out. But there's a greater problem with an autobiography, which is, it is your subjective view. A biographer can take the wider picture. He can set your life in the context of the society, the country, the globe at the time. He can locate it in the context of what's happening in society, in politics, in culture, in law, in sport, and so on and so forth. So, had I not worked on Elwin, had I not had the great good luck while working on Elwin to spend a year in Berlin and be trained, informally trained, by the great British biographer of Goethe, Nicholas Boyle, I would not have dared to tackle Gandhi. And then I came to Gandhi. And I'll now spend the second half of my talk telling you about how I approached Gandhi as a biographer. Now, I was the first person who wrote on Elwin. Later on, I wrote a book which is largely a biography. It's a history of cricket, but largely centered around the story of four Dalit brothers, the Palwankar brothers. I was the first people to write about them. So I was the first biographer of Elwin. I was the first social historian of Indian cricket. But why the hell did I become the 500th or 1000th biographer of Gandhi? So I must explain that to you. I took up writing on Gandhi broadly for four reasons. First, that in all my previous works, Gandhi had been a presence. He'd been shadowing me all my life. I wrote on environmentalism, and there was Gandhi. I wrote on Elwin, there was Gandhi. I wrote India after Gandhi, and there was Gandhi. And I wrote a book on cricket, a book that Gandhi, a game that Gandhi had an intense magisterial indifference to. Not a dislike. An indifference is worse than a dislike. And yet, when I compiled the index to my history of Indian cricket, I found there were 40 references to Gandhi because whether he liked it or not, he had influenced how cricket was played, shaped, organized, debated about in India. So first, I had to settle my accounts with this guy who had shadowed me all my professional life. Whatever I wrote on, environment, cricket, anthropology, post-independence history, that fellow was there somewhere lurking in the background. I said, अब मैं तुमको दिखाऊंगा, मैं तुम्हारे बारे में लिखूंगा. That's lesson number one. Second, I'd been giving lectures and teaching courses on Gandhi, both in India and abroad. And I found I actually had lots of interesting things to say about Gandhi, which didn't appear to be there in the existing biographies. Thirdly, I understood that Gandhi, like the Buddha, was a genuinely global figure. And again, what he said and the debates he inculcated were actually relevant to many parts of the world. I'll tell you a story about this. I was teaching a course at Berkeley on Gandhi, and my host said, well, you're welcome to teach a course on Gandhi, but we'd rather you taught on your earlier work on environmentalism, because, you know, California is the state of solar energy, innovation, tree huggers. You'll have lots of students. I said, I'd rather teach on Gandhi. And they said, no, you only have ABCDs. America-born confused Desis, and more likely only ABCD EFGs. America-born confused Desis emigrated from Gujarat. And I ducked, some of you who know me personally know I'm a really obstinate fellow. I said, no, I'm only going to teach on Gandhi. And I went there, and it was an extraordinarily international audience. There were African Americans, Jews, a Burmese student who was in exile, Europeans, and some Indians, a Chinese and some Indians. And on the flight back from San Francisco to Bangalore, a long flight, I reflected on this course, how much I'd enjoyed it, and I posed this counterfactual. Supposing an American professor at Berkeley was to come to Bangalore and offer a course on Lincoln, how many people would there be? So I realized that the Gandhi's reach was absolutely global, and I must do justice on him. And I found in the course of my research, finally, that there were lots of new and rare sources on Gandhi that I could exploit in my work. So each of these four, especially the secondary characters in Gandhi's life, and the range of sources beyond Gandhi's collected works, about which I'll say a little bit in a minute, were there waiting to be explored by someone like me. Now, Gandhi, among other things, was an incredibly prolific writer. He may have published more in his life than more or less all the writers in this, not published, he may have written more in his life than more or less all the writers in this literary festival combined. There are 100 volumes of Gandhi's collected works, which are available in the 3 languages he wrote, English, Gujarati, and Hindi, cross-translated when they need be. These were compiled after his death in a project initiated by Jawaharlal Nehru and Gandhi's son Devdas Gandhi, who felt, now that Gandhi is gone, we must really bring to the world all that he ever said, so that, including some of the nasty things he said, but also the truly heroic and perceptive and prescient things he said. So this 100 volumes contains all that they could find. Gandhi's articles in his newspapers, Gandhi's speeches, Gandhi's interviews, Gandhi's letters, Gandhi's Silence Day notes, Gandhi's books, Gandhi's pamphlets. Now, the original, this project took from 1958 to 1994. In 1994, 90 volumes appeared, chronologically, from the 1880s till his death in 1948. In the course of their collecting of materials, the editors of the collected works discovered supplementary letters that had escaped them while they were doing these chronological volumes. So they brought out 7 supplementary volumes. They had made 97, 90 plus 7, 97. Then they added a very important volume called Index to Persons. So you look at Ambedkar, you can see all the volumes in which he is mentioned. Then volume 99, Index to Subjects, where he says women, where all is mentioned. They should have stopped there. and 99 volumes. But this being India, and since we invented the zero, in their wisdom or lack thereof, the publications division brought out a wholly redundant 100th volume, which was called, which contained the individual prefaces to the first 97 volumes. But still, you had to read these 99 volumes. And unfortunately, or as it happened, most scholars of Gandhi write on the basis of the 99 volumes. So I had to read them. And I did read them more than once. But I knew that Boyle's law demanded attention to multiple sources apart from those emanating from the subject himself. So I looked for letters from Gandhi, letters to Gandhi, which are not in the collected works, but which are in the Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, where you have to transcribe them by hand. Letters about Gandhi, which are in archives all around the world. Intelligence reports about Gandhi, compiled by the colonial press, which are in South Africa and India and America. His correspondence with friends and what the friends said. And these are again in archives everywhere. Newspaper accounts of what Gandhi said and wrote and how they were differently perceived. So you read the Times of India on Gandhi, you will get the establishment view, which you may still get while you read the Times of India. But I'm talking about the 1930s. If you read the Times of India on the Salt March, you will get the colonial establishment view. If you read the Bombay Chronicle, you will get the nationalist view. So you have to read newspapers. So I decided that I must do all this research, and I'm not going to tell you about all the different archives I visited and consulted and how many years it took me. I think I've been preparing for Gandhi all my life, and my 2-volume biography took me almost 2 decades. Among my favorite archives were in the course of this thrilling journey was the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi, the Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, which I mentioned, the British Library in London, where I found many rare unpublished letters written by Gandhi, not in the collected works, the National Archives in Pretoria in South Africa, where I found stuff about Gandhi's first son, Harilal, whom you know about, who had a terribly conflicted attitude towards his father. In America, in the Quaker archive in Swarthmore College, where I contained the papers of Gandhi's Quaker colleagues. So more than 60 collections I consulted in the course of my research. And I won't say much about that. But my exploration of sources that don't originate with Gandhi, that go beyond the 100 volumes which most scholars rely on, is one aspect of my fulfilling my teacher Nicholas Boyle's mandate. The second is the secondary characters. And I'll say a little bit about that, because I think that's something I took particular pleasure in. How I followed Boyle's second law, which is about how a biography is really made by its secondary characters. When my second volume was in draft, I had lunch in New York with my editors. I had the great privilege of working with 2 of the most remarkable editors, English language editors of the modern world. Sunny Mehta, who was Indian by origin and retained an Indian passport till he died, who ran Knopf, and his colleague Dan Frank, who was an American who ran Knopf's sister imprint Pantheon. And when Sunny Mehta commissioned my Gandhi biographies, he told me, when I sent the draft of my first volume, he said, I will get Dan Frank to read it because he's an American who knows nothing about Gandhi and India. And that was incredibly wise of him, because Sunny could correct me on some aspects. But to have a completely fresh, uncluttered mind, tell me which section was too long, which character needed more about him or her, where my interpretation needed to be more nuanced was, So tragically, Sunny and Dan are now both dead, and I feel bereft. These 2 great editors of my Gandhi volumes. But let me recall at least a lunch I had with them in New York, where I had written the second volume of my Gandhi biography. And at this lunch, Dan said, he said that, Ram, I was trying to check, and I'm sure that apart from Gandhi, there are at least 100 characters in your book who are interesting. And Sunny said maybe closer to 150. And I'm not going to tell you all about the 150, because that takes it tomorrow morning. or day after. But I'll tell you a little bit about three of the crucial secondary characters in Gandhi's Indian life with whom Gandhi had intense and transformative relationships. The first was B.R. Ambedkar. Now, I've written a column in the Telegraph today which is on Richard Attenborough's film, which came out 40 years ago this week. Now, among the remarkable things about Attenborough's film is that Ambedkar doesn't figure. Now, you can have the good guys like Patel and Nehru. You can have the bad guys like Jinnah. But how do you portray Ambedkar, with whom Gandhi had the most intense, complicated, rivalrous, but also enigmatic relationship over a period of 25 years? And this relationship has been deeply represented in contemporary political polemic. So the Gandhian nationalists see Ambedkar as a British stooge because he worked with the British and was in the Viceroy's Executive Council during the Quit India movement. The radical Ambedkarites see Gandhi as a upper caste apologist who never did enough for the Dalits. But the truth is much more complicated. And very few people, one of whom is the great Kannada writer Devanur Mahadeva, recognize that India needed both Gandhi and Ambedkar. One to mobilize the Dalits from below, and the other to shame upper caste Hindus like Gandhi's own colleagues. And the relationship was utterly fascinating. Ambedkar was born in 1891. He was 23 years younger than Gandhi. And obviously was too proud to join the Congress, too independent-minded to become a chamcha of Gandhi, and had a different philosophical and political orientation towards the Dalits. And over a period of time, over 20 years of intense and sometimes bitterly polemical engagement, they came closer together, which I talk about in my book. And I believe I've provided a fuller, more historically rooted, and hopefully less polemical account. It's not adequate. I mean, if the Ambedkar-Gandhi relationship has to be done true justice in all its poignancy and how do I put it? In its contradictions and poignancy, you needed a great playwright. Perhaps the late Girish Karnad should have written a play on Gandhi and Ambedkar. But I believe I've done more justice to both of them. I've been able to see both of them as heroes in approaching the problem of untouchability from different perspectives. Different but complementary perspectives. That's Ambedkar. The second character I want to say a little bit about, Sarla Devi Chaudhrani, who was a beautiful, gifted Bengali writer, poet, nationalist, the niece of Rabindranath Tagore, with whom Gandhi fell passionately in love at the age of 50. And this story of Gandhi's intense romantic but sexually unfulfilled relationship with Sarla Devi, but intensely romantic and emotional, had never been told in depth before. There had been restrained references to it in earlier works, but because of prudence or restraint, it hadn't been treated with any depth. Gandhi's letters to Sarla Devi are there in the collected works. But Sarla Devi's replies were burnt by Gandhi's descendants. Fortunately, I found a few letters written by Sarla Devi that had escaped the keepers of the flame and were in the Sabarmati archives. But from other stuff that Gandhi wrote, people wrote around him, you could see how deeply involved they were. Sarla Devi was, in many ways, everything was Kasturba was not. She was outgoing, charming, eloquent, multilingual, and Gandhi fell for her. And Gandhi was everything Sarla Devi's husband was not. Because he was a regular lawyer in Lahore making a living and occasionally going for a dharna, not the Mahatma of the nation. So you could see why they were so intensely attracted to each other. And then Gandhi was told by his colleagues, look, you have to decide. Do you want to lead us to freedom or follow your heart? And he took the, I won't say safer path. I won't say that. He took the more, shall we say, globally transformative path. But because he had to abort that friendship, he also was consumed by guilt because he had taken a vow of celibacy 13 years before he met Sarla Devi. And here he almost lived for this lady. And he was calling her my spiritual wife. Now, what kind of a thing is a spiritual wife, we'll have to figure out. But Gandhi's later experiments with celibacy, Brahmacharya, which are the most difficult to understand of anything he did, can directly be traced to this intense and passionate engagement. That's character number 2. Character number 3, and my favorite in the whole book, is Gandhi's secretary Mahadev Desai. Now, one nationalist once described Nehru, Patel, and Rajaji, who were Gandhi's 3 closest disciples, Nehru, Patel, and Rajaji, as respectively the heart, the hand, and the head of Bapu. So Nehru was the heart, Patel was the hand, and Rajaji was the... It's a beautiful description and utterly accurate. But Mahadev was the head, the heart, and the hand all together. And because he was Gandhi's secretary, always living with him, and deliberately wrote himself out of Gandhi's life. You know, one doesn't recognize how significant he was. And I think my book, which is based on huge amounts of unpublished material about Mahadev, including the 400 condolence messages Gandhi got when Mahadev died, which was in a file which I saw for the first time in an archive in Delhi, tell you what an extraordinary man he was. And I would urge you to read my biography of Gandhi, if for no other reason, to learn about Mahadev Desai, who was, the history of India, who died in 1942 when he was only 50. The history of India would have been different and better if Mahadev had lived as long as some of Gandhi's other contemporaries. But let me at least quote you one line from Mahadev. It's a verse, it's a quatrain. It's not the most elegantly written verse. English was Mahadev's 3rd language. It doesn't scan perfectly, but it beautifully captures how living with Gandhi, being Gandhi's closest companion, his interlocutor, his translator, his friend, his secretary, his conscience keeper, was at once a privilege and a burden. And this quatrain written by Mahadev Desai reads, "To be with a saint in heaven is bliss and glory. To be with a saint in heaven is bliss and glory, but to be with a saint on earth is a different story." Now, readers can read my Gandhi biographies and decide how well I've met my objectives. But I'm going to end on a lighter note by telling you of offers I've got to write biographies of other people. I wrote a book on Elvin. I wrote a biography of these Dalit cricketers. I've written a 2-volume biography of Gandhi. I write a lot of pen portraits in the press, so much so that a rivalrous writer in Delhi once was heard to complain, "Guha only writes about you if you are dead." So I've done a lot of biography writing. And because of this, I get commissions. People ask me. So when I wrote on Elvin, I got a call from a relative of Atal Bihari Vajpayee saying, "आपने ये जीवनी लिखी है, वो लोग उसकी बहुत तारीफ कर रहे हैं, praising it. आप प्रधानमंत्री जी के बारे में लिखिए, जीवनी लिखिए." Vajpayee was in power. And this person said, "Lots of copies will be sold. The state will buy 50,000 copies. You can have a photograph taken with the Prime Minister to sell more copies." And obviously, I did not write it. So I want to be polite. So I said in Hindi, I said, "ये तो Elvin थे, वो छोटे-मोटे लेखक थे, साइडी राइटर. इतने पूछे प्रधानमंत्री जी के बारे में कैसे लिखूंगा? How the hell will I write about Vajpayee?" So that was the first commission I turned down. Then I got later commissions. So a well-known test cricketer who lives in this town, after he retired, said, "Will you please write my biography?" That was easy to turn down. Then a well-known scientist who lives in this town celebrated a certain landmark, 70th, 75th, 80th, I won't specify, to make it more difficult for you to identify the person. And his secretary said, "Professor so-and-so wants you to write his life to be timed with the birthday." Now, these were easy to reject because, but then I was asked, the one that I really contemplated for a long time was after my Gandhi books came out, several people asked me to write on Ambedkar. So people would come up to me in a flight reading my Gandhi book and said, "Sir, you have to write about Ambedkar next because there isn't really a good book about him." And I was seriously tempted, but I didn't because You can write about a retired test cricketer in 3 months, about his whole life and achievements. But to write about Ambedkar would take 30 years, and I'm already in my 60s. So I thought I couldn't do him justice. Now, so I've got many, many different kinds of offers. I've done biographical writing. My last book, Rebels Against the Raj, is about 7 remarkable foreigners who joined the freedom struggle, and I'll continue to write different kinds of biographies. But I want to end with the oddest commission I've got. Much more odd than writing about Vajpayee or a cricketer or a scientist or an economist. One of the offers was from a very famous Indian economist who had been a governor of the Reserve Bank and director of many famous institutions. I gave a talk in Bombay, and at the end of the talk on Gandhi, someone said, "Sir, we have to write, we urgent to contact you." And what I say when this happened, I had to flight to catch. I had a flight to catch. I said, write to my new email address. And the letter came which said, "Sir," this is 2013, "I would like to introduce myself as a consultant for Sri Gautam Adani, and I would like you to write a life of Gautam Adani and explain the terms." And I wrote a polite letter saying, "I'm sorry, I'm occupied with writing the second life of my Gandhi biography." Now, this is 2013. Mr. Modi was about to come to power. Mr. Adani knew what will happen when Mr. Modi comes to power with his own life, and the journey would continue. So this invitation to write Adani's life, I shared with a few friends. Say, look what people are asking me. So one friend, one of my closest friends, now deceased, wrote to me saying, "There's one very good reason to accept. And this is, when you write your memoirs, you have the perfect title. From Gandhi to Adani, a biographer's journey." Thank you.